On New Year's Eve, my mother handed out gifts to every grandkid, except mine. Then my sister posted online that we chose drama when we walked away. She never expected me to drop receipts that exposed years of lies, favoritism, and a secret property deal. By Christmas, her perfect family image was gone, and this time she couldn't delete the truth. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 41 years old, married to Olivia for 13 years, and we have 2 kids, Ethan, who is 10, and Mia, who is 8, and for most of my adult life, I convinced myself that what I was feeling about my family was just old insecurity that never fully went away. I am the youngest son, the middle child technically, with my older brother Brandon at 44 and my younger sister Courtney at 39. And somehow, I have always felt like the extra chair at a table that was designed for 4, but never really needed 5. Brandon is the pride of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, a high-profile orthodontist with a glossy office, magazine features framed in his waiting room, and patients who drive in from neighboring counties just to say they go to him. Courtney lives her life online. Perfectly filtered brunches, matching holiday pajamas, carefully staged candid family moments that get thousands of likes. And then there is me, living 70 minutes away in Maple Hollow, working a steady but unremarkable job, raising my kids in a modest house with a backyard that needs reseeding every spring. I never thought I needed to compete with them, but somehow I always felt like I was being compared. Despite the distance, we always showed up. Every birthday, every backyard barbecue, every Thanksgiving dinner with the same heavy dining table and the same strained conversations about politics and real estate. 70 minutes each way with 2 kids in the back seat asking how much longer, but we went anyway because that is what family does. Olivia never complained. At least not out loud, and she packed casseroles and gifts and wrapped everything neatly with handwritten cards because she believed in showing up fully even if the effort was not always matched. The first time I noticed something was off with my kids, I brushed it aside. Ethan had just won a regional robotics award, something he had poured months into, staying up late building and rebuilding circuits at the kitchen table while I held a flashlight so he could see better under the wires. He stood on that small stage of metal that looked too big for his thin neck, grinning like he had just conquered the world. I took a photo of him holding the certificate and sent it to the family group chat, expecting at least a string of congratulations. My father replied with a thumbs-up emoji and then immediately changed the subject to Brandon's new office expansion. When we visited the following weekend, and I showed him the printed photo, he barely glanced at it before placing it face down on the counter as if it were a grocery receipt. I told myself my dad was just not expressive. He had never been the emotional type. Maybe I was projecting my own need for validation onto him, and maybe it was unfair to expect him to gush over robotics when he had spent his life in construction and did not understand what a microcontroller even was. I swallowed the disappointment and told Ethan that Grandpa was proud, even though I had not seen any proof of it. Mia's school recital was harder to ignore. She had practiced her piano piece for weeks, sitting upright on the bench with her tongue slightly sticking out in concentration, repeating the same measures until her fingers stopped fumbling. My parents said they would come, and they did, sitting in the 3rd row with polite smiles. Halfway through the program, before Mia even walked onto stage, my mother leaned over and whispered that they needed to leave early to beat traffic back to Cedar Ridge. I watched them stand up and shuffle out while other grandparents stayed, clapping loudly for children who were not even their own. When Mia finished her piece and scanned the audience, I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes before she found us and forced a small smile. At cousins' birthdays, the contrast was even sharper. Brandon's kids received extravagant gifts, custom bicycles, the latest gaming consoles, envelopes with crisp bills tucked inside cards that spoke of bright futures and limitless potential. Courtney's daughter once received a charm bracelet with a different charm representing every year of her life so far, each one explained in detail by my mother as if unveiling heirlooms. When it was Ethan's birthday, my parents called to say they would celebrate next time because they had a charity gala that weekend. Mia's birthday fell on a Saturday when my father had a golf tournament, and they promised to stop by the following week, but never did. A card arrived in the mail with a generic message, and a gift card that felt like an afterthought. For years, I told myself I was being sensitive, that maybe distance played a role, that maybe my siblings' visibility made their lives easier to celebrate. Brandon's success was tangible and public. Courtney's life was broadcast daily, while ours unfolded quietly in a suburb that did not trend online. I reminded myself that my parents were aging and set in their ways, that favoritism was a strong word, that surely they loved all their grandchildren equally even if they showed it differently. But patterns do not disappear when you ignore them. They simply become clearer. I started to notice how my father's face lit up when Brandon walked into a room, how my mother reposted Courtney's photos within minutes, but forgot to respond to Olivia's messages about school plays. I noticed how often my kids' achievements were met with silence or mild nods, while my niece's dance recitals were treated like Broadway premieres. The worst part was not the absence of praise. It was a gradual realization that my children were becoming background noise in their own family gatherings. Ethan stopped bringing up robotics around his grandparents because he sensed a lack of interest. Mia clung closer to Olivia at parties, quieter than usual, watching her cousins open presents with wide eyes. They were not complaining. They were adapting, shrinking themselves in spaces that were supposed to feel safe. The thought that haunted me was not that I had never been the favorite child. I had made peace with that long ago. It was a dawning awareness that whatever invisible hierarchy existed in my childhood had extended to the next generation, and my kids had somehow inherited my place at the bottom without ever doing anything to deserve it. Every year, my parents host an elaborate New Year's Eve party at their house in Brookstone Heights, and it's always felt less like a family gathering and more like a carefully staged abduction designed to showcase success, connections, and illusion of unity. The driveway fills with luxury SUVs and polished sedans. Coats of wool and cashmere are draped over banisters. Catered trays circulate through rooms scented with expensive candles, and my mother moves through it all like a director, making sure every angle is camera-ready. There are always professional photos, coordinated decorations, champagne flutes lined up in perfect rows, and a countdown rehearsal as if midnight itself might misbehave without proper planning. We arrived that night dressed up, because that is what you do when you attend something that feels half gala and half family obligation. Olivia wore a deep blue dress that shimmered subtly under the chandelier lights, and she held Mia's hand as we stepped inside from the cold. Mia had begged for silver glitter shoes she had seen in a store window weeks earlier, insisting they were fancy enough for Grandma's party, and she walked carefully across the polished hardwood floors as if afraid to scuff them. Ethan wore a navy blazer and a tie because he remembered my father once saying that a young man should dress sharp for important occasions, and even though that comment had been casual and years ago, Ethan held on to it as if it were a rule carved in stone. He had practiced tying that tie 3 times before we left the house, determined to get it right. The music was already playing, low jazz layered under the hum conversation, and the room buzzed with the kind of laughter that sounds slightly too loud, slightly too rehearsed. Brandon stood near the bar telling a story about a high-profile client, while people leaned in attentively, and Courtney adjusted her phone on a small tripod near the fireplace to capture candid moments that were anything but candid. My parents moved between guests with easy smiles, introducing people, gesturing toward the food, refilling glasses, always aware of who was watching. At 9:15 p.m., my mother clinked her champagne glass with a spoon, and the room slowly quieted, conversations tapering off into expectant silence. She stood near the staircase where the lighting was best, my father at her side, with one hand resting proudly at the small of her back. Her voice carried clearly, practiced, and warm, as she announced that they had a little surprise for the grandkids who had made them extra proud this year. There was a ripple of excitement among the children, a shift in posture as they straightened up and glanced at one another. A sleek black gift box appeared on a small table beside her, its lid glossy under the lights, tied with a satin ribbon that suggested something meaningful inside. She began calling names with deliberate pauses that allowed the crowd to react. To Logan for straight A's this year, she said, and Brandon's son stepped forward grinning, while applause filled the room and cameras lifted into the air. To Harper for helping so much with the baby, she continued, and Courtney's daughter received her box with a shy smile, while my mother brushed imaginary tears from her eyes. To Mason for winning soccer MVP, she added, and another cousin jogged forward as cheers echoed and someone whistled in approval. Each child was hugged, praised, photographed, and handed a black box as if they were receiving an award on stage rather than standing in their grandparents' living room. I felt Ethan shift slightly beside me, his hand tightening around the hem of his blazer. He had earned high marks in his classes too, and he had spent countless hours building and programming his robotics projects, but he did not move because he was waiting for his name. Mia stood on her toes, silver shoes catching the light, her eyes wide and hopeful. I watched my mother glance briefly at the list in her hand, then look up with a bright smile as she closed the lid of the remaining box and thanked everyone for another wonderful year. The applause resumed, louder than before, glasses clinked, and conversations restarted as if nothing significant had just occurred. The box closed, and that was it. Ethan's name was never called. Mia's name was never called. There was no hesitation in my mother's expression, no sign that she had skipped a line or forgotten a detail. It unfolded smoothly, intentionally, as though the absence was part of the design. Ethan swallowed hard and forced a small nod, pretending to adjust his tie, while looking toward the bar instead of at the staircase. Mia tugged gently at my sleeve and leaned close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my arm. In a small voice that trembled despite her effort to keep it steady, she asked if Grandma had forgotten. In that moment, the room felt unbearably loud, the laughter sharp and hollow, the music intrusive. I looked at my parents standing there glowing under the chandelier, surrounded by guests who admired them, and I understood with clarity that made my chest tighten that this was not an oversight. This was not traffic, not busyness, not distance, not miscommunication. This was a deliberate pattern playing out in front of an audience, my children standing quietly in formal clothes they had chosen carefully to earn approval that never arrived. I saw Ethan straighten his shoulders in a way that reminded me painfully of myself at his age, learning to minimize expectations before they could be disappointed. I saw Mia blink rapidly, holding back confusion more than tears, trying to process why her cousins were celebrated publicly while she remained invisible. Something inside me, something I kept contained for years with excuses and rationalizations, cracked open in that instant. It was not a dramatic outburst or a shouted accusation. It was quieter and heavier than that, a realization settling into place with undeniable weight. I had spent years telling myself I was imagining favoritism, that I was too sensitive, that family dynamics were complicated but fundamentally fair. Watching my children stand there overlooked in a room full of applause proved that I had not been imagining anything at all. We did not cause a scene that night, even though every part of me wanted to walk back into that living room and demand an explanation in front of the same audience that had just applauded my children's absence. Olivia saw in my face before I said a word, the tightening of my jaw, the way my hand curled slightly at my side as if bracing for impact, and she reached for Mia immediately, pulling her close and smoothing a hand over her hair as if to shield her from something invisible but sharp. I placed my hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling how rigid he had become beneath the blazer he had been so proud to wear, and I squeezed gently, hoping the pressure translated into reassurance even though I felt anything but steady inside. We waited for a natural lull, for a moment when no one was looking directly at us, and we walked toward the door as quietly as we had arrived. The music was still playing, laughter rising and falling behind us, champagne glasses clinking in preparation for midnight. No one stopped us. No one called out our names. No one noticed that people were slipping out of the house before the countdown. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap, sharp and clarifying, and for a second I just stood there on the porch, listening to the muffled noise from inside, realizing how easy it was for us to disappear. The drive home was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of distant fireworks going off in other neighborhoods. Mia leaned against Olivia in the back seat, her silver glitter shoes dulled now in the dim light, and Ethan stared out the window with an expression far older than 10 years should allow. I kept my eyes on the road, because I knew that if I looked at them for too long, I might not be able to hold myself together. Midnight passed somewhere between Brookstone Heights and Maple Hollow, marked not by cheers and a countdown, but by the quiet ticking of the dashboard clock. The next morning I woke up with a strange mixture of dread and certainty, half expecting my phone to be filled with missed calls or messages asking where we had gone. I imagined my mother's voice, feigning concern, asking if everything was all right, or my father sending a short text about us leaving early. Instead, there was nothing, no notifications, no missed calls, no group chat messages lighting up the screen. The silence was not accidental. It was complete, intentional in its absence. There was no "where did you go?" and no "Happy New Year," sent later as a polite afterthought. It was as if we had never been there to begin with. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold and reread the empty thread, feeling the weight of it settle into something solid and undeniable. Olivia moved around quietly, making breakfast for the kids, her movements careful, controlled, as if she too was bracing for something that might still come. Ethan and Mia did not mention the party, but the way they avoided talking about it spoke louder than any complaint could have. They had understood more than I ever wanted them to. I typed one message into the family group chat, reading it over several times before pressing send. I kept it simple because I did not trust myself to write anything longer without letting anger seep through in ways that would only be dismissed as overreaction. I wrote that we would not be attending future gatherings. There were no accusations, no explanations, no dramatic declarations. Just a statement, clear and final. The message showed as delivered, then read. The small indicators that confirmed someone had seen it felt almost mocking in their efficiency. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3. 7 days went by without a single response. Not from my parents, not from Brandon, not from Courtney. No attempt to clarify, no defense, no apology, not even a challenge to what I had said. The silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. I had expected at least resistance, some version of disbelief or outrage, but instead there was indifference, and somehow that hurt more. On the seventh day, Courtney posted on Instagram. I saw it because despite everything I had not yet brought myself to unfollow her. The caption read, "Late Christmas with the grandbabies. So thankful for a family that always shows up," followed by a string of pink heart emojis. The photos were polished and bright. My parents' living room decorated in the same tasteful way it had been on New Year's Eve, wrapped gifts stacked neatly near the fireplace. Brandon's kids were front and center, tearing open boxes while my mother clapped and my father smiled proudly behind them. There were close-ups of laughter, of embraces, of matching pajamas and coordinated sweaters. Every image radiated warmth and belonging. My children were not there. There was no mention of us, no tag, no explanation for the missing branch of the family tree. The framing was careful enough that anyone scrolling through would assume the gathering represented the whole family. The caption about always showing up felt like a deliberate rewrite of reality, a public narrative crafted without space for contradiction. We had always shown up, even when it meant long drives and quiet disappointments, even when it meant swallowing small hurts for the sake of unity. Now, because we chose to step away once, the story had shifted to imply that we were the ones absent by choice, unreliable, detached. I stared at those photos longer than I should have, studying the angles, the smiles, the background details, noticing how seamlessly we had been edited out of frame. It was not just that we were not tagged. It was that there was no trace of us ever having existed in that context. No empty chair hinted at our absence. No comment referenced missing cousins. It was clean, curated, complete without us. That was when the final piece settled into place. We were not just overlooked in moments of praise or forgotten in speeches. We were expendable in the larger narrative. When we stopped attending, nothing fractured. No one reached out. The machine of family image continued without interruption. We were not dramatic enough to be confronted, not significant enough to be missed. We were simply erased, quietly and efficiently, as if deleting us required no more effort than cropping a photo before posting it online. 2 weeks passed after my message in the family group chat. 2 weeks of complete silence that felt less like space and more like a calculated pause. And then my brother finally reached out. It was not a call, not an attempt to talk things through like adults who supposedly care about each other. It was a text message, short and stripped of tone, the kind of message you send when you want to minimize something without fully engaging in it. He wrote that I had overreacted and that the gifts were not a big deal. That was it. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the silence. No mention of the fact that my children had stood in a room full of applause and been publicly excluded. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding because I could feel a familiar pull to doubt myself creeping back in, that old instinct to assume I had exaggerated the situation, that maybe I had let years of quiet resentment distort what was really just an innocent oversight. But the image of Mia tugging my sleeve and whispering that question replayed in my mind with painful clarity, and I forced myself to answer calmly. I asked him one simple thing. If it was not a big deal, why were my kids the only ones without anything? The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for the chance to correct me. His response came in a single line that felt colder than the winter air outside my window. Maybe they just did not earn anything this year. Earn anything. I read those words again and again, trying to process how effortlessly they had been written. My 10-year-old son, who had spent months building a robot from spare parts at the kitchen table, who had stayed up late debugging code with determination to humble me, apparently had not earned anything. My 8-year-old daughter, who practiced piano until her fingers were sore, who helped her mother set the table without being asked, who poured her heart into handmade cards and school projects, apparently had not earned anything either. The idea that affection or acknowledgement from grandparents had to be earned like a performance bonus at a corporate job shifted something fundamental inside me. It was not just dismissive, it was transactional. It implied that love, or at least public recognition of it, was conditional, distributed according to some invisible metric that only they controlled. It reframed the exclusion as merit-based, as if my children had failed an exam they did not even know they were taking. In that moment, I stopped trying to decode the logic behind their behavior. I stopped searching for benign explanations. There's a difference between misunderstanding someone and realizing that you are operating under completely different moral frameworks. I did not argue with him after that. I did not send a long message defending my children's accomplishments or listing their qualities, as if submitting evidence in a trial. I understood that if someone can look at two kids standing quietly in formal clothes and conclude they simply did not earn recognition, then we are not debating facts. We are debating values. A few weeks later, Valentine's Day approached, and Mia decided on her own that she wanted to send Grandma a card. She sat at the dining table with colored paper spread out in front of her, tongue peeking out in concentration the way it always does when she is focused. She cut out small hearts carefully, gluing them in a pattern that she measured with surprising precision, and she wrote in her neat, slightly slanted handwriting that she loved and missed her. She asked me how to spell certain words and whether glitter would be too much, and when she finished she held the card up proudly as if presenting a masterpiece. We mailed it the next morning. Mia checked the mailbox every afternoon for several days afterward, half expecting a card in return or at least some small acknowledgement. None came. There was no phone call, no text to Olivia, no message in the group chat saying thank you. The silence felt deliberate this time, sharper because it followed everything else. A few days later, Courtney posted another series of photos online. She had gathered all the Valentine's cards that the cousins had sent to my parents and arranged them neatly across the dining table, each one photographed in close detail. There were captions praising how thoughtful the grandkids were, how blessed my parents felt to be surrounded by so much love. I scanned the images carefully, my chest tightening with each swipe. I recognized the handwriting of Brandon's kids, the pastel envelopes from other cousins. Mia's card was not there. It was not hidden in the background. It was not partially cropped. It was absent. That was when the last fragile thread of doubt snapped. This was no longer about oversight, busy schedules, or miscommunication. You do not accidentally exclude the same children repeatedly across different occasions. You do not forget a card that arrives in your mailbox and then carefully curate a public display of every other card. What I was witnessing was not chaos or incompetence. It was structure. There was a hierarchy in my family, one that had existed quietly for years but had become more visible as the next generation grew old enough to notice. Brandon at the top, golden and untouchable, his children extensions of his success. Courtney close behind, her curated life feeding into the image my parents seemed desperate to project. And then somewhere below, out of frame unless absolutely necessary, was me and by extension my children. Hierarchy explains the silence. It explains the transactional language about earning recognition. It explains how easily we could be excluded without disruption to the overall narrative. Once I saw it clearly, I stopped trying to fit our experiences into kinder interpretations. I stopped wondering whether I was too sensitive or whether my expectations were unrealistic. I understood that in their version of family, worth was ranked, visibility was selective, and my children had been placed on a lower rung without ever being told the rules of the ladder. Here's the part they did not expect me to look into, the part that shifted everything from emotional ambiguity into something documented and undeniable. Years earlier, my father had called the three of us together to discuss estate planning in what he described as a responsible and transparent conversation about the future. We sat around his dining table while he explained that he and my mother wanted to avoid conflict down the line and ensure that everything would be handled smoothly when the time came. He emphasized more than once that everything would be split fairly, that there would be no surprises, that he had seen too many families torn apart over money and would not allow that to happen to ours. I remember feeling a strange sense of relief at the time, as though whatever quiet imbalances existed emotionally would at least not extend into something as concrete as inheritance. At that meeting, he specifically mentioned the lake house, the one my grandfather built decades ago with his own hands, hauling lumber in the back of a pickup truck and laying each board carefully along the shoreline. That house had always been presented to us as symbolic, not just property but legacy, something that belonged to all of you equally, as my father put it. Those words stuck with me because they carried weight. All of you equally. It sounded definitive, protective, like a promise carved into stone rather than spoken casually over coffee. After everything that had happened over the past months, after the party in the silence and the carefully curated erasure, I found myself thinking about that meeting in a different light. Patterns rarely exist in isolation. If there was hierarchy in affection and visibility, it was not unreasonable to question whether there was hierarchy in assets as well. I did not want to believe it, but belief had become less reliable than evidence. I contacted an old college friend who had gone into estate law and built a solid reputation over the years. I did not approach him with accusations or drama. I simply asked him to help me understand how trusts and property transfers typically worked and whether there was a way to confirm that what we had been told matched what had actually been filed. He explained that while trusts themselves should be private, certain property transfers and ownership changes often leave public records. His tone remained professional, but I sensed a shift when I described the situation in more detail. The public filing showed something I had not been prepared for, even though part of me suspected it. Partial ownership of the family lake house had already been transferred to Brandon and Courtney the year before. The paperwork was clean, legally sound, and dated well before the New Year's party, before the Valentine's card, before any of the recent confrontations. It had been done quietly, without another family meeting, without an update to the conversation that had once emphasized fairness. My name did appear in the trust documentation, but in a different capacity than I had assumed. I was listed as a beneficiary with limited control, meaning I would receive a share under certain conditions but would have no authority over how the property was managed or decisions regarding its sale or use. Brandon was designated as sole executor, granting him full authority to oversee the estate and interpret the terms of the trust when the time came. Courtney's position aligned with his in ownership, even if not in execution authority. Structurally, it created a dynamic where two siblings held power and tangible stakes, while I held a conditional interest dependent on decisions I would not control. I read through the documents multiple times, searching for some clause that would clarify or soften the imbalance, but the language was precise and deliberate. Partial ownership was not a placeholder or a temporary measure. It represented a shift in control that had already occurred. The lake house my grandfather built, the place where we learned to fish off the dock and roast marshmallows by the fire pit, the place that was framed as shared heritage, had been legally tilted in favor of two of us long before I ever questioned my position in the family. What struck me most was not just the distribution itself, but the secrecy surrounding it. If everything was meant to be fair and transparent, why was there no follow-up conversation acknowledging that ownership had changed? Why was the original promise left to stand uncorrected while legal documents told a different story? The absence of disclosure mirrored the pattern I had already witnessed with my children. Publicly, the narrative remained inclusive. Privately, the structure told another story. Apparently, all did not include me in the way I had believed. All meant something conditional, something flexible depending on perspective. I thought back to my brother's message about earning recognition and felt a cold consistency in how things were arranged. Authority consolidated at the top, visibility curated carefully, participation allowed but control withheld. For years, I had dismissed subtle differences as personality quirks or circumstantial favoritism. Seeing my name positioned differently on official documents removed the last layer of plausible deniability. This was not about misunderstandings at family gatherings or social media optics. It was about decisions made deliberately, recorded formally, and never communicated honestly. The hierarchy was not just emotional. It was structural, written into the framework of what would outlast all of us. Sitting there with copies of filings open in front of me, I realized that the New Year's party had not been an isolated humiliation, but a reflection of something far more entrenched. My children were not randomly excluded from applause. I had not randomly been placed in a limited role within the trust. The pattern extended across years and across domains, from public praise to private assets. The lake house that was supposed to symbolize unity had quietly become another reminder that in my family, equality was a word used for comfort, not a principle applied in practice. Instead of confronting them after discovering the estate filings, instead of sending screenshots and demanding explanations that I already knew would be redirected back at me as overreactions, I changed strategy. I realized that every time I tried to engage directly, the outcome was the same: minimization, reframing, or silence. They thrived in spaces where perception could be managed and narratives could be polished. I decided to step out of that arena entirely. If there was a hierarchy in their version of family, then the only power I truly had was to stop participating in it. We stopped chasing approval in ways that were subtle at first, but intentional. I no longer prompted my kids to call their grandparents after achievements, no longer reminded them to send updates that would likely go unanswered or acknowledge a generic response. I stopped adjusting our schedule around events we were not truly wanted at. The energy that had once gone into proving we belonged was redirected inward, towards strengthening what existed within our own four walls. Mia had always loved drawing, filling notebooks with detailed sketches of animals and imaginary landscapes, and I had previously treated it as a sweet hobby. Now I looked at it differently. I enrolled her in advanced art classes at a local studio where the instructor took her seriously, teaching her about shading, composition, and perspective instead of handing her coloring pages. The first time her artwork was displayed on a small gallery wall alongside older students' pieces, I watched her stand a little taller, her pride rooted in genuine recognition rather than conditional applause. I made sure I was at every showcase, standing close enough that she could see me immediately when she looked up, Ethan's science competitions became non-negotiable dates on my calendar. If there was a robotics meet or a presentation, I was there early, helping him carry his project inside, listening to him rehearse his explanation one more time in the car. I did not just attend, I paid attention. I asked him about the technical details, about what had failed the first time and how he fixed it. When judges spoke to him, I stood back but remained fully present, not as a silent observer but as someone invested. I made sure he understood that his effort did not need to be compared to anyone else's to be worthy of pride. We started small traditions that belonged only to us, rituals that did not require an audience or validation. Saturday mornings became pancake mornings, not occasionally but consistently. I would wake up before the kids, mix the batter from scratch, and experiment with different additions. Blueberries one week, chocolate chips the next, sometimes shaping the pancakes into imperfect hearts or initials just to make them laugh. We would sit around the kitchen table still in pajamas, syrup dripping, talking about whatever came to mind. There were no phones at the table, no scrolling, no distractions. It was ordinary and simple, which made it powerful. One weekend we rented a small cabin a few hours away and left our phones off for most of the trip. The cabin was nothing like my parents' lake house, no polished dock or inherited legacy attached to it, just with paneling, a creaky porch, and a quiet stretch of trees. We hiked without documenting it, cooked dinner together without photographing the plates, played board games by lamplight without posting a single update. I watched my kids relax into the absence of comparison. There was no curated version of us to maintain, no invisible scoreboard measuring worth. There was just us, contained and complete. At the same time, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, I began creating a private photo archive. It was not dramatic, not some elaborate revenge file labeled with anger. It was organized, methodical, almost clinical. I saved screenshots of group chat messages that went unanswered. I stored images from social media posts where we were absent or cropped out. I documented dates of gatherings we were not informed about until afterward. I kept copies of the estate filings and the timeline of when ownership had shifted. I did not add commentary or emotional notes. I simply recorded facts. I told myself that it was not about weaponizing anything immediately. It was about having a clear record in case the narrative ever twisted further, in case my children one day questioned their own memories or were told a version of events that painted us as distant or uninterested. I had lived too long in the gray space of doubt, second-guessing my perceptions because there was no tangible proof. This archive was not fueled by rage, but by a need for clarity. Truth, when quietly preserved, becomes a stabilizing force. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed something else shift inside me. The urge to confront diminished, replaced by a steadier resolve. My focus narrowed to what I could control: the atmosphere in our home, the consistency of our presence, the messages my children absorbed about their worth. I no longer measured family by who applauded the loudest in a crowded living room. I measured it by who showed up repeatedly, who listened carefully, who stayed when things were uncomfortable. In stepping back from them, I was not retreating. I was rebuilding on different terms. I understood that hierarchy only functions if those at the bottom continue to accept the ranking. By investing fully in my own household, by creating traditions and documenting reality without spectacle, I was quietly dismantling the part of the system that depended on our participation. Whether they noticed or not no longer defined the outcome. What mattered was that my children would grow up knowing that recognition in our home was not earned through comparison, not granted conditionally, and not subject to being withdrawn for the sake of image. 2 weeks before Christmas, after months of distance that had been treated by them as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than the result of years of exclusion, an invitation arrived in our mailbox that looked like it belonged to a charity gala. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, my name and address printed cleanly in a formal font, the flap sealed with a smooth sticker that caught the light. Inside was a card edged in gold with embossed lettering that announced the annual Dawson family Christmas brunch and included a line that read, "Let's reconnect." It listed the date, the time, the dress code, and even suggested arriving early for photos. It did not include an apology, not even a single sentence acknowledging what had happened. It carried the tone of someone reopening a door they had never bothered to close, as if our absence had been a brief scheduling conflict rather than a boundary drawn in response to harm. Olivia read it once and set it down without expression, and I watched the kids look at it with that cautious curiosity they had developed over the past year, the kind that comes from learning not to expect kindness from a place that has disappointed you. I did not debate the response in my head. I did not draft multiple versions, searching for the perfect balance between politeness and honesty. I wrote back formally, because formality was the only language they seemed to respect when emotions were inconvenient. I told them we would not be attending, and asked them to respect our space. I kept it short and direct and sent it, then returned to the quiet rhythm we had built in our own home, the routines that made my children feel safe and seen. A few days later, Courtney posted again. She always posted when she wanted control of the narrative, when she needed to frame reality in a way that made her look generous and wounded at the same time. The photo was soft and curated, a warm background with neutral palette, perhaps a candle and a mug of something seasonal, her usual aesthetic that suggested peace and maturity. The caption said that no matter what happens, they choose love, and some people choose distance. It was phrased like wisdom, like a gentle statement of principle, but I understood it for what it was. It was a public insinuation that we were the ones rejecting family, that our absence was a cold choice rather than a response to being repeatedly minimized and erased. Normally, I would have ignored it. I had spent months learning to conserve my energy and keep my attention where it mattered. But this time the post reached beyond her usual circle because a mutual acquaintance, someone who knew our family enough to notice the missing faces, commented asking where Nathan's family was. It was simple and direct, the kind of question that would have been harmless if it had been answered honestly. Courtney replied that some people create drama. That was her entire explanation for why my children had been absent from photos, why our family had been excluded, why we were no longer present at gatherings. It was not an attempt to understand or resolve. It was a label meant to discredit, the kind of shorthand that makes others stop asking questions. I felt something settle in my chest then, not rage, but a clear, sharp resolve. It was one thing to endure neglect quietly. It was another to watch my children be reframed as collateral in a story where we were cast as unstable and disruptive simply for refusing to accept being treated as lesser. I had built my private archive for a reason. I had documented the ignored messages, the exclusions, the cropped photos, the filings, the timeline, not because I wanted to destroy anyone, but because I refused to let my family's reality be rewritten while we stayed silent. That was the moment I corrected the narrative. I did not write a long comment, defending myself. I did not accuse Courtney of cruelty, or call my parents names, or vent about favoritism. I did not appeal to emotion, because emotion was what they would claim made me irrational. I responded the way my father had always valued, with facts and proof, clean enough that it could not be dismissed as a tantrum. I posted a single link in the comments. Behind that link was a carefully organized timeline, laid out in chronological order, with dates, screenshots, and scanned documents. It included the group chat message where I said we would not attend future gatherings and the week of silence afterward. It included Courtney's post showing Brandon's children at my parents' house with captions about family always showing up, contrasted with the absence of my children. It included a note of when Mia's Valentine's card was mailed and the subsequent post that displayed every cousin's card except hers. It included the estate filing showing partial ownership of the lake house transferred to Brandon and Courtney, and it included documentation of Brandon being named sole executor, while I was listed with limited control. I included the New Year's video clip as well. It was brief, unedited, and it showed exactly what happened. My mother announcing a surprise of grandkids who made them extra proud, calling names, handing out sleek black boxes, the applause, and in a moment the box closed and the speech ended with no mention of Ethan or Mia. There was no voiceover and no commentary. The camera simply recorded what the room had applauded, and the absence was visible enough that anyone watching could understand it without being told how to feel. I did not add insults. I did not add commentary. I let the record speak for itself. Within minutes, the tone of the comments shifted. People stopped reacting with vague sympathy for Courtney's vague heartbreak and started reacting to specifics. Some asked why the children had been excluded. Some asked why gifts were tied to earning. Some asked why property transfers had been hidden while fairness had been promised. I did not respond further. I did not debate in the thread. I simply left a link there, anchored, quietly refusing to be erased again. Within 24 hours, her post disappeared. It did not fade gradually. It was simply gone, the caption and the carefully staged image removed as if it had never existed. The comments vanished with it, including the question about where my family was and the reply about drama. That disappearance was more revealing than any argument could have been. If she truly believed her version of events, she would have stood by it. If love and distance were truly the whole story, she would have had no reason to delete anything. But the moment the narrative was confronted with documentation, the platform that had been used to imply my children with a problem could no longer be controlled. And control was always the point. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired and oddly calm. I had not done it to humiliate them. I had done it because my kids deserved to exist in the story, even if we were no longer part of their curated family image. The truth had been spoken once, clearly and without theatrics, and for the first time in a long time, I felt as though reality had been anchored somewhere outside their version of events. The fallout was immediate and predictable, almost as if they had rehearsed their roles the moment the post disappeared. My phone began lighting up with messages in rapid succession, each one carrying the same underlying theme, but wrapped in different tones of accusation. Brandon was the first, direct and indignant, telling me that I had humiliated Mom as if humiliation had not been a quiet thread running through my children's experiences for years. Courtney followed with a message claiming that she had been crying, positioning herself as the wounded party in a situation built on documented facts. My mother's message was shorter but heavier in emotional weight, telling me that I had broken her heart, as though my response to being erased was more damaging than the erasure itself. My father's message arrived last, restrained and authoritative, stating that some things should stay private, which felt less like wisdom and more like an admission that privacy had been useful as long as it protected their image. Not one of them addressed the timeline. Not one of them disputed the accuracy of the screenshots or the estate filings. There was no denial that the lake house ownership had shifted quietly, no explanation for why Mia's card had gone unacknowledged while others were displayed, no clarification about why my children's names were absent that New Year's Eve. The focus was entirely on my method of response, on the fact that I had made the information visible rather than keeping it contained within a dynamic that relied on silence. The narrative had shifted from questioning the truth to condemning the exposure of it. I read their messages carefully, noticing how each one framed me as the aggressor. I had humiliated. I had caused tears. I had broken a heart. I had violated privacy. The pattern remained consistent. Responsibility flowed upward. Consequences flowed downward. The hierarchy had been challenged publicly, and their discomfort was framed as proof of my wrongdoing. There was no acknowledgement that the only reason the link had been shared was because Courtney had chosen to publicly label my family as dramatic. There was no recognition that I had spent months saying nothing before correcting a false implication. Instead of engaging in a back and forth that would spiral into familiar territory, I did something final. I opened the photo archive I had built and selected a single image. It was simple and unembellished, a photograph of Mia's Valentine's card sitting unopened on my parents' entry table, captured during a brief visit months earlier when I had noticed it still resting there among unopened mail. The envelope was slightly bent at one corner, her handwriting visible, bright and hopeful against the plain background. It had never been opened. It had never been acknowledged. It had never been included in any curated display of love. I sent that image to the group chat without additional commentary beyond a single line. I wrote that this was their chance to fix it. I did not elaborate. I did not argue. The image spoke clearly enough. It represented not just a card, but a child reaching out and being met with indifference. It represented a moment where repair could have happened quietly and privately, long before anything was posted publicly. It represented the opportunity they had ignored. After sending it, I left the chat. I did not wait for responses. I did not watch for typing indicators. I blocked their numbers one by one, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I understood that continuing the conversation would only reopen wounds without resolution. Blocking them felt less like slamming a door and more like sealing a boundary that had already been drawn. Christmas morning arrived without the usual tension of wondering whether we were expected somewhere else or whether we were missing an event that would later be reframed as our absence. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than lonely. Olivia brewed coffee while the kids padded into the living room in pajamas. Their excitement centered entirely on what was in front of them rather than what might be happening elsewhere. There were no comparisons, no anxiety about being photographed, no subtle calculations about how we would be perceived. We opened gifts slowly, laughing when wrapping paper tore unevenly, lingering over small surprises. The simplicity of it felt almost radical after years of orchestrated gatherings. Later that evening, after dinner dishes were stacked in the sink and the day had softened into that warm post-holiday calm, Mia climbed onto the couch beside me. The lights in the tree cast a gentle glow across the room, and she leaned her head against my shoulder in a way that felt both childlike and thoughtful. She asked if we were ever going back. There was no fear in her voice, only curiosity, as if she wanted to understand the shape of our future. I did not hesitate. I told her that we do not go where we are not celebrated. I did not say tolerated. I did not say included conditionally. I said celebrated, because that is what children deserve from the people who claim to love them. They deserve to feel wanted without earning it, to feel visible without competing for it. She smiled in a way that was small but certain, as if the answer aligned with something she had already sensed. She said good, and there was relief in that single word. It was not the relief of rebellion. It was a relief of clarity. For the first time in years, I felt my own smile come without effort. It was not forced for the sake of harmony. It was not performative. It was grounded in the quiet understanding that protecting my children's sense of worth mattered more than preserving a facade of family unity. The hierarchy they had built could continue without us. The narrative they curated could exclude us. But within the walls of our home, there was no ranking, no transaction, no performance required to belong. There was only presence, consistency, and the kind of love that does not need an audience to be real.